Do you remember Bobby DeBarge's soaring, fractured falsetto? That voice that made millions of women cry and scream his name, believing they were hearing the ultimate love song. But the brutal truth was far darker. That same voice was the suffocating gasp of a man who loved men. A man forced to sell a straight heartthrob fantasy to the entire world just to keep his career alive. Motown knew his agonizing secret all along, and on August 16, 1995, when his voice finally shattered and the fatal AIDS diagnosis had already destroyed him, they kicked him to the curb like garbage, leaving him to die alone, broke and abandoned in a cold hospital room, still forbidden to ever love who he truly was. This is the darkest secret Motown tried to bury forever. The heartbreaking truth behind the voice that broke millions of hearts and the empire that sucked him dry, then let him die in the most tragic, lonely way imaginable. Like this video and subscribe right now, because what you're about to hear, Motown never wanted the world to know. Chapter 1. Childhood from Hell. Let's go back to those years. Back to Detroit in the 1950s and 60s, to the very beginning of Bobby DeBarge's story. To a place where love was supposed to live, but terror ruled instead. March 5, 1956, Detroit, Michigan. In the shadow of the roaring auto plants and the post-war American dream, Robert Louis DeBarge Jr. entered the world. He was the first son in what would eventually become a family of 10 children. A loud, crowded household on the surface, but one that hid a nightmare no outsider could ever imagine. From the moment Bobby could walk, the DeBarge home was not a sanctuary. It was a battlefield. His father, Robert DeBarge Sr., a white Army veteran with a hair-trigger temper, ruled the house with an iron fist and a belt that never seemed to rest. Night after night, the walls echoed with the sounds of screaming, slapping, and the sickening thud of fists meeting flesh. Robert Sr. didn't just discipline his children, he broke them. He would explode without warning, dragging Bobby or one of his siblings into another room while the rest of the family huddled together, praying it wouldn't be their turn next. The psychological torment was just as cruel. Constant humiliation, mocking, and the message drilled into every child. You are worthless. You are nothing without me. Bobby, as the oldest boy, carried the heaviest weight. He learned early to stay silent, to shrink himself, to become invisible whenever the storm approached. But inside that terrified little boy, something even more dangerous was beginning to stir. The family's life revolved around the strict, fire and brimstone Pentecostal church. Bobby's mother, Ederline, a deeply religious woman who sang in the gospel choir, tried to hold the family together with faith, but the sermons Bobby heard every Sunday were merciless. The preacher's voice would thunder from the pulpit. Homosexuality wasn't just a sin, it was an abomination. It was something that would send you straight to eternal flames. God hates what you are, the words implied. You will burn for it. For a sensitive, artistic boy, already feeling the first confusing pulls of attraction toward other boys, those words didn't just scare him, they shattered him. By the time Bobby turned 13 or 14, the truth he could no longer deny hit him like a freight train. In the quiet moments after school, alone in his room, he realized he was different. He wasn't drawn to the girls his friends talked about. His heart raced for something society, his father, and his church all declared unforgivable. The fear was suffocating. What if his father found out? What if God really did hate him? Every glance, every innocent thought became a knife twisting in his chest. He started sleeping with the lights on, terrified that his own mind was betraying him. He smiled for his siblings during the day, but at night he lay awake, tears streaming down his face, whispering prayers that God would change him, or just make the feeling stop. There was no one to talk to, no safe adult, no language in 1960s Detroit to even name what he was feeling. The pressure inside his young mind became unbearable. And then, at just 15 years old, Bobby found the only escape available on the streets of his working-class neighborhood: drug It wasn't about getting high for fun. It wasn't teenage rebellion. It was survival. In the haze that heroin brought, the constant fear, the self-hatred, the terror of his father's fists, and God's judgment all went quiet for a little while. For the first time, Bobby felt something close to peace, even if that peace came at a terrible price. The drug wrapped around his broken spirit like a cold blanket, numbing the pain he had carried since birth. But it also planted a seed that would grow into a lifelong shadow, following him for the rest of his days. By 1974, the nightmare at home finally reached its breaking point. After 21 years of marriage filled with violence, Ederline filed for divorce from Robert Sr. The legal papers were signed, and the family packed what little they had and fled Detroit for a fresh start in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Bobby was 18 now, technically a man, but still carrying the shattered pieces of a childhood that had never let him breathe. He stepped off that bus in Grand Rapids with two invisible chains around his neck. The deep, unspoken trauma of years of physical and emotional abuse, and a growing dependency on the very thing that had once promised him relief. The move gave the family distance from the man who had terrorized them, but it could not erase what had already been done. The scars ran too deep. The secret Bobby carried about who he truly was remained locked inside, heavier than ever. This was the boy who would one day stand on stage and sing with a falsetto so beautiful it made the world weep. But long before the lights and the screaming fans, long before Motown ever knew his name, Bobby DeBarge was already learning how to bleed in silence, how to smile while dying inside, and how to turn unimaginable pain into something the world would one day call art. Chapter 2: Career Journey. The scars from those Detroit nights never really left him, but when the bus pulled into Grand Rapids in 1974, Bobby DeBarge stepped off with something else burning inside, a desperate, almost furious hunger to turn pain into power. He was 18, broke, addicted, and carrying a secret that could destroy him. Yet every single day, in a tiny, dimly lit apartment on the east side of town, he locked himself away for hours. The neighbors would hear it through the thin walls, the same haunting falsetto, rising and falling like a wounded bird trying to fly. He practiced until his throat bled, fingers flying across a battered second-hand keyboard, chasing chord progressions he heard in his head. That's where Gregory Williams first found him, another local musician with big dreams and no roadmap. Gregory walked into one of those smoky after-hours jam sessions and heard Bobby hit a note, so pure, so fragile, it stopped the room cold. The two young men locked eyes across the stage, and in that moment, a partnership was born. They started building something real, a band that could actually play, actually sing, actually move people. Gregory handled the arrangements. Bobby became the voice, that soaring, aching falsetto that seemed to carry every unsaid word he could never speak out loud. But the road to the big time was brutal. They played tiny clubs, dive bars, and half-empty VFW halls across Michigan, driving through snowstorms in a beat-up van with no heat. Nights blurred together, cheap motels, stale cigarettes, and the constant shadow of the needle that still whispered Bobby's name when the applause died down. Yet the music kept pulling him forward. Then came the break that changed everything. In 1975, through a friend of a friend, the band landed an audition for Barry White, the undisputed king of orchestral soul, the man whose deep baritone made women melt, and whose image defined what a male R&B star was supposed to be. They nailed the audition. Barry christened them White Heat, and suddenly these Grand Rapids kids were on the biggest stages in America, backing one of the most successful acts on the planet. The lights of a sold-out arena in Los Angeles, thousands of women screaming. Backstage one night after a blistering set, Barry pulled Bobby aside. The larger-than-life star, dressed in his signature white suit, placed a heavy hand on Bobby's shoulder and looked him dead in the eye. "Listen, son," Barry rumbled in that famous velvet voice. "Out there, you gotta give 'em what they want. You smile at the ladies. You make 'em feel like you're singing just for them. You walk like a man who knows how to love a woman. That's the game. You play it right, or you don't play at all." Bobby forced a laugh and nodded, but inside something cracked. He watched Barry work the crowd every night, the slow grind, the bedroom eyes, the way the entire industry revolved around selling that unbreakable heterosexual fantasy. And Bobby? He was learning the rules fast. In this world, a man could have the voice of an angel, but if he didn't sell the right kind of love, the doors would slam shut forever. The White Heat chapter ended as quickly as it began. Business disagreements, one underperforming album. But Bobby and Gregory refused to go back to the local circuit. They rebranded as Hot Ice and in 1976 flew to Munich, Germany to record their first real album, Pall Mall Groove, for Polydor. Munich was a whirlwind of disco lights, electronic beats, and cold European winters. In the studio, Bobby finally got to layer his voice the way he'd always dreamed, stacking harmonies until the falsetto sounded like a choir of broken hearts. Yet even there, thousands of miles from home, the secret followed him. Late nights after sessions, he'd slip out alone, chasing the only thing that still quieted the storm inside. The heroin was no longer just medicine. It was the price he paid to keep performing while pretending to be someone else. Back in the States by 1977, the grind continued. But in 1978, everything shifted again. The band had relocated to Los Angeles and landed the audition of a lifetime, a private session for Jermaine Jackson and his wife, Hazel Gordy, daughter of Motown founder Berry Gordy himself. The room was small, tense, and electric. Bobby sat at the piano, fingers trembling just slightly, and launched into an early version of what would become There'll Never Be. Jermaine leaned forward, eyes wide. "Damn, that voice. You wrote that?" Bobby nodded, siling the practiced heartthrob smile he was already perfecting. But as the last note faded, Hazel suddenly asked, half joking, "So, Bobby, you got a girl waiting back home? Because with a voice like that, the ladies are going to lose their minds." The question hung in the air like smoke. For a split second, Bobby's smile froze. He could feel Gregory glance at him sideways, the only person who suspected the truth. Bobby forced a smooth laugh and answered, "Oh, you know how it is. I'm keeping my options open," while inside his chest tightened like a vice. That single moment, that casual question, was a warning shot. Motown wasn't just signing a band. They were signing an image, and Bobby knew right then that his secret would have to stay buried deeper than ever if he wanted this dream to survive. They signed on the spot. The group was renamed Switch, a perfect name for how seamlessly they could switch instruments mid-song, and more importantly, how Bobby would have to switch between his real self and the fantasy the label demanded. Their self-titled debut dropped in 1978, and There'll Never Be exploded. Radio stations couldn't play it enough. The album went gold in months. Then came Switch 2 in 1979 and This Is My Dream in 1980, with hits like I Call Your Name and Love Over and Over Again. Overnight, Bobby DeBarge became the ultimate heartthrob. Magazine covers, screaming fans, limousines, sold-out tours. Women wrote him letters by the thousands, confessing their love, begging for one night. He smiled for every camera, signed every autograph, performed every suggestive stage move Motown choreographed. But at night, back in the hotel suite, the mask came off. The heroin, now joined by cocaine, became the only thing that let him sleep after another day of lying to the world. The voice that made millions fall in love was the same voice that cried in silence, because the love he sang about was never the love he was allowed to feel. This was the golden rise. The world saw a star being born, but the boy from Grand Rapids already knew the price he would eventually pay. Chapter 3. Dark Motown secrets, clearly known. Climax. The lights were brighter than ever. The money was pouring in. But for Bobby DeBarge, the higher he rose, the darker the cage became. It was the winter of 1979 in Los Angeles. Cold Pacific rain drumming against the windows of the Motown executive offices on Sunset Boulevard. Bobby sat across from a sharp-suited A&R man who didn't even bother to look up from the publicity plan. "From now on," the man said, tapping a glossy headshot of Bobby, "you're not just the lead singer of Switch, you're the fantasy. Every teenage girl in America needs to believe she could have you. You smile at the cameras, you flirt on stage, you give them the dream. No rumors, no questions, no slip-ups, or we pull the plug." Bobby nodded, the same practiced heartthrob smile he had perfected for the cameras. But inside, the words landed like ice. Motown wasn't signing talent anymore. They were buying an image. And that image had to be 100% straight, 100% available, 100% safe for the screaming female fanbase that was buying millions of records. So they built the perfect lie. Late one humid summer night in 1980, the label arranged the first public date with LaToya Jackson. Flashbulbs exploded outside a Beverly Hills restaurant as Bobby and LaToya stepped out together, her hand on his arm, both of them smiling for the photographers. The next morning, every teen magazine from Right On to Ebony ran the story. Bobby DeBarge and LaToya Jackson, R&B's new power couple. It was pure PR stunt, but it worked. The whispers in the industry about Bobby's private life went silent overnight. Motown had their shield, yet even that wasn't enough. By 1981, the pressure had become suffocating. Executives began hinting that Bobby needed a wife, a real one, to kill any lingering doubt forever. So he did what so many men in his position did in that era. He married Terry DeBarge, a quiet, beautiful woman who genuinely cared for him. They had 2 children. On paper, it looked perfect. The heartthrob had settled down. Family man, role model. But behind the closed doors of their Los Angeles home, Bobby was living 2 completely separate lives. By day, he was the smiling father and devoted husband the cameras loved. By night, the secret he had carried since Detroit clawed at him harder than ever. The toll was brutal. Picture the tour bus rolling through a freezing Midwest blizzard in the winter of 1982. The rest of Switch was laughing, playing cards, celebrating another sold-out show. Bobby sat alone at the back, curtains drawn, snow whipping against the windows like tiny knives. His hands shook as he prepared the needle, heroin mixed with cocaine now, the only combination strong enough to quiet the war in his head. "Just one more hit," he would whisper to himself, "so I can get on stage and pretend again." The drugs were no longer a choice. They were the only thing keeping the mask from cracking in public. And then there were the recording sessions, the moments when the truth slipped out, whether he wanted it to or not. One rainy Thursday afternoon in Motown Studio A, Bobby stood at the microphone, headphones on, eyes closed. The track for "I Call Your Name" was playing. As he hit that famous soaring falsetto, his voice cracked on the high note, not from lack of skill, but from pure, unbearable pain. The engineer in the booth leaned forward, grinning. "That's the money note right there, Bobby. That hurt. The fans loved that hurt." They had no idea. To the millions listening on the radio, those trembling, desperate high notes were the sound of a man begging for a woman's love. But to Bobby, every cracked falsetto was a coded scream. "I'm dying inside. I'm not allowed to love who I truly love. I'm trapped." He was singing his truth in plain sight, yet the world only heard romance. And Motown? They counted the money and kept the machine running. They knew. They had to know. The late-night parties, the rumors, the way Bobby sometimes disappeared for hours. Motown security and management were too sharp to miss it, but they chose profit over protection. As long as the albums kept going gold and the tickets kept selling, the secret was safe. They weaponized his pain, packaged it as love songs, and cashed the checks while Bobby slowly bled out on the inside. The empire that built itself on his fractured voice never once offered him help. No counseling, no quiet support, no protection when the whispers grew too loud. Just more photo shoots, more tours, more pressure to be the perfect, straight heartthrob. Keep smiling, Bobby. The girls are buying the records. By 1983, the double life had become unbearable. The heroin and cocaine were no longer numbing the pain. They were devouring him. His weight dropped. His voice, once so effortlessly beautiful, began to fray at the edges. Yet every time he stepped on stage, the lights hit him, and the crowd screamed, he delivered. Because that was the deal he had signed with Motown. Give us your soul, hide everything real, and we'll make you a star. They took everything he had and gave him nothing in return except a golden cage and a promise that if the truth ever came out, they would drop him faster than he could fall. This was the cruelest part of the Motown machine, the part the public never saw. They didn't just know Bobby's secret. They profited from it. They fed on it. And when the day finally came that he could no longer carry the weight, they would prove exactly how little they cared. Chapter 4. Collapse and Death Left to Rot. The fall came faster than anyone could have imagined. It was the spring of 1981. Switch had just released their fifth album, Switch 5, and the group was still riding the wave of hits Bobby had built. But inside the rehearsal halls of Los Angeles, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Bobby's addiction, now a vicious cocktail of heroin and cocaine, had turned him into a ghost of the disciplined artist who once led the band. Sessions dragged on for hours while he disappeared into bathrooms or hotel rooms. His voice, once so effortlessly soaring, started to waver. Tensions boiled over with Gregory Williams and the rest of the group. One humid afternoon in a dimly lit Motown rehearsal space, with the smell of stale coffee and cigarette smoke hanging in the air, Bobby was quietly told his services were no longer needed. He was out, just like that. The man who had created the sound, written the hits, and carried the group to platinum status was replaced, while his younger siblings, Elle, Bunny, Mark, Randy, and James, exploded onto the charts as DeBarge. They were using the exact falsetto runs, the exact harmonic structures Bobby had taught them. Hits like All This Love and Time Will Reveal sounded like his ghost singing through them. The architect watched from the sidelines as the family dynasty he built soared without him. The 1980s rolled on like a slow-motion nightmare. Bobby drifted through sporadic collaborations, trying to chase the solo deal Motown had dangled in front of him. But the drugs owned him now. By the summer of 1988, the desperation had reached its breaking point. August 1988. Grand Rapids, Michigan. The same city where he had once rebuilt his life after fleeing his father's violence. Federal agents moved in at Detroit Metropolitan Airport after a tip. Bobby and his younger brother Chico, Jonathan DeBarge, along with two other men, were caught in a sting operation. They had conspired to smuggle more than 2 pounds of cocaine from a Los Angeles nightclub back to Michigan. The courtroom in Kalamazoo was cold and sterile on that October day in 1988 when the federal jury delivered the verdict. Bobby, wrists cuffed, sat stone-faced as the judge read the sentence. 5 years in a Wisconsin state penitentiary. No leniency for his past fame. The man who once filled arenas was now inmate number whatever, stripped of everything except the secret that had haunted him since childhood. Prison was hell in ways the world never saw. The fluorescent lights buzzed endlessly in the intake wing of the Wisconsin facility. During the mandatory medical screening, a doctor drew blood and ran the standard tests. Days later, behind the thick bars of his cell, a guard slid a sealed envelope under the door. Bobby opened it alone. The words hit like a hammer. HIV positive. He had contracted the virus in the late 1980s through intravenous drug use. The same needle that had once numbed his pain had now delivered a death sentence. The prison walls closed in tighter that night. No counseling, no special treatment. Just the brutal reality that AIDS in 1988 was still considered a death sentence, especially inside a place where fear and stigma turned inmates into outcasts. Bobby confided only in his family during visits, his voice cracking over the phone as he whispered the diagnosis. Outside those walls, Motown remained completely silent. No statements, no support. No calls from executives who had once counted millions off his voice. The label that had profited from his pain simply erased him from their history, pulled his photos from archives, stopped mentioning his name in retrospectives, and let the machine roll on without him. The industry that once celebrated Switch now treated Bobby DeBarge like he had never existed. He served every day of those 5 years. When the gates finally opened in 1993, Bobby stepped out a changed man, gaunt, sober for the first time in decades, but already carrying the invisible weight of a failing immune system. He vowed to stay clean. He moved briefly to California, staying with his old bandmate Gregory Williams, then returned to Michigan. With the last of his strength, he poured everything into one final act of defiance, recording the album It's Not Over. The songs had been written in his prison cell, raw, unpolished reflections on mortality, regret, and redemption. In small independent studios in 1994, with limited resources and no Motown polish, Bobby laid down vocals that cracked and rasped where his famous falsetto once soared. You could hear the virus in every breath, the frailty, the exhaustion, the truth he no longer had to hide. But time was running out. By the summer of 1995, the illness had taken over completely. In the sweltering heat of July, his family made the painful decision to bring him back to Grand Rapids, the city where his story had begun and where it would end. They placed him in a quiet hospice facility on the outskirts of town. The room was small, with beige walls and a single window looking out onto a parking lot lined with old cars. No flowers from record labels. No visitors from the industry that had once begged for his time. Just family. His mother Ederline, a few siblings, and the wife and children he had tried so hard to protect with his lies. Bobby lay there day after day, his once powerful frame reduced to skin and bones, breathing labored through an oxygen mask. On the afternoon of August 16, 1995, under a gray Michigan sky, Robert Louis DeBarge Jr. slipped away at the age of 39. Complications from AIDS. The official cause of death was quiet. The man who had made millions weep with his voice died almost alone. The funeral was heartbreakingly small. A simple service in Grand Rapids. A few close friends and family members. No red carpets. No Motown executives in the front row. No tributes from the stars he had helped create. The industry that had sucked every ounce of life from him simply moved on, as if Bobby DeBarge had never existed. They had taken his voice, packaged his pain as romance, sold it to the world, and when he needed them most, they turned their backs and let him die in silence. The boy from Detroit, who only wanted to be loved for who he truly was finally free. But the world never let him live that truth while he was still breathing. In the end, the boy who once dreamed of turning his pain into beauty was buried at 39 years old, alone in a quiet Grand Rapids cemetery under a gray Michigan sky. No executives showed up. No flowers arrived from the label that had built an empire on his fractured voice. The same industry that sold millions of records by packaging his hidden agony as romance simply moved on, erasing him as if he had never existed. Bobby's story is more than one man's tragedy. It's a brutal reminder of what the music business was willing to do to its brightest stars. Demand they smile, demand they lie, demand they die inside so the machine could keep turning. He taught us that behind the glittering falsettos and screaming fans often hides a human being who was never allowed to be whole. So the next time you hear that soaring, heartbreaking voice in There'll Never Be, remember the man behind it. Not just the heartthrob the world wanted, but the man the world refused to let live.